The truck's engine coughed twice before settling into a rough idle. Garrett Ashford sat behind the wheel of his 1998 Ford F-150, hands still gripping the cracked leather, staring through a windshield, hazed with 17 years of highway grit. The road ahead had narrowed to little more than two parallel tracks cutting through birch and pine, the kind of road that didn't appear on phone maps, the kind that disappeared entirely when snow came. He was 48 years old and down to his last $8,000. The manila envelope sat on the passenger seat where a person might have sat if there had been anyone left. Inside were the papers he'd signed 3 days ago in a county office that smelled like old carpet and fluorescent lights. 160 acres of northern Minnesota land purchased outright, no loan. No questions. The clerk had looked at him the way people looked at men who paid cash for things nobody wanted. "You know there's restrictions on this parcel," she'd said, sliding the deed across the counter. "I know. Development setbacks, conservation easements. Can't build within 300 feet of the shoreline. I'm not building anything." She'd studied him, then really looked at him, saw the weathered field jacket with the sleeves pushed up to the elbows, saw the military watch with the scratched crystal and the band worn thin, saw the posture of a man who'd spent years standing in places where slouching could get you killed. "You a veteran?" she'd asked. "Navy." She didn't ask what kind. That was good. Garrett didn't talk about what kind. Now the truck sat at the edge of what was technically his property, though ownership felt like a word for something more solid than this. The land stretched out before him in a gentle slope toward a lake he couldn't quite see through the trees. Tall grass moved in waves under an August sun. Dragonflies cut geometric patterns through air so clear it hurt to breathe. It was the kind of beautiful that made a man suspicious. Garrett killed the engine. In the sudden silence, he heard the wind moving through leaves, the distant call of a bird he couldn't name, and from the back seat, the quiet shift of weight that meant Kodiak was awake. "We're here," Garrett said. The German shepherd's ears rotated forward, processing the information. At 7 years old, Kodiak carried himself with the disciplined economy of a professional. His black and tan coat was short and dense, built for work rather than show. His amber eyes tracked movement the way trained eyes always tracked movement, assessing threat levels, calculating distances, measuring the space between safety and something else. Garrett opened the driver's door. The hinges protested with a sound like a question being asked. He stepped out onto earth that felt too soft after hours of asphalt boots, sinking slightly into soil that held moisture even in summer. The air smelled of pine resin and water, and something underneath that he couldn't quite identify. Something old, something patient. Kodiak emerged from the back seat in one fluid motion, landing lightly, immediately moving into a loose perimeter check. No wasted energy, no puppyish enthusiasm. Just systematic coverage of the immediate area, nose working the breeze ears, cataloging sounds that existed below human frequency. This was a dog who'd spent 6 years in military service before a torn ACL, and changing budget priorities had retired him early. Explosive detection, primarily. Some patrol work. Some things Garrett didn't talk about and Kodiak couldn't. The Navy had given Garrett the option to adopt him when the paperwork came through. It hadn't really been a choice. The truck's hood ticked as the engine cooled. Garrett walked around to the passenger side and pulled out the canvas pack he'd carried in 13 different countries. Inside was everything he'd decided mattered: camping gear, water filtration, a medical kit that had saved 2 lives and couldn't save a third, and a folding knife his father had given him 30 years ago, with instructions to keep it sharp. He'd kept it sharp. Kodiak completed his initial sweep and returned sitting precisely 6 feet away, waiting. Not anxious, not eager, just present in the way professionals were present, ready for orders or ready for silence, equally comfortable with both. "Let's set up camp," Garrett said. They moved together through the clearing toward a stand of pines that offered high ground and natural drainage. Garrett had learned a long time ago that you didn't fight terrain, you worked with it. He chose a spot where the earth was firm and the canopy was thick enough for shade, but open enough to see the sky. Always know where the sky was. That lesson had been written in blood in a place that smelled like burning diesel and copper. He unpacked methodically. Tent first. It was military surplus olive drab designed for 2 people who didn't mind being close. He drove the stakes at 45-degree angles, testing tension, with his palm adjusting until the lines sang when he plucked them. The structure went up clean and tight, except it leaned slightly to the left. Garrett stepped back, hands on his hips, studying the problem. The ground wasn't as level as he'd thought. The rear stake needed to come up 6 inches. Simple fix. He reached for the mallet. Kodiak sat 10 feet away watching, his head tilted exactly 7 degrees to the right. Garrett paused. "I see it," he said. The dog's ears flicked once, that was all, but something in Garrett's chest loosened some knot he hadn't realized he was carrying. It was the smallest thing, a crooked tent, a dog's silent judgment. A moment of humor so quiet it barely registered as humor at all, but it was the first time he'd smiled in 6 weeks. He pulled the rear stake and repositioned it. The tent settled into proper alignment. Kodiak's head returned to neutral. The world turned. Everything continued. By the time the sun started its long slide toward the western tree line, Garrett had established a functional camp. Tent secured, gear stowed, fire pit dug and ringed with stones pulled from the lake shore. He'd walked the perimeter twice, noting landmarks, checking sight lines, identifying water sources, and potential hazards with the automatic assessment of someone who'd survived by noticing things other people missed. The lake itself sat beyond the trees, maybe 200 yards down a gentle slope. He could see it now, fragments of blue between pine trunks, water so clear it looked like a photograph of water rather than the thing itself. The shoreline was soft with cattails and wild iris. No boats. No docks. No signs that anyone had been here in years. Exactly what he'd wanted. Exactly what he'd paid for with money he couldn't afford to spend. Garrett sat on a fallen log and drank water from a canteen that had crossed the Euphrates River twice. The water here tasted clean and cold, pulled from a hand pump he'd spotted near the property line. Good water, honest water, water that didn't lie about what it was. Kodiak moved through the camp in a slow patrol, nose low, reading the invisible history written in scent. He paused occasionally, analyzing filing information away in whatever database military dogs kept. Garrett watched him work. There was something meditative about it, watching a professional do professional work, even when the work was just understanding a new piece of ground. The sun hung lower now, warming everything to gold. Insects rose in clouds from the grass. Birds called their evening negotiations. It was the kind of peace that made Garrett's shoulders tighten, because peace in his experience was usually the space between threats rather than the absence of them. But he was trying. That's what the therapist at the VA had said, the one he'd seen 3 times before, deciding that talking about things made them louder, not quieter. "You need to find a place where you can rest," she'd said. "I sleep fine." "That's not what rest means, Mr. Ashford." He'd stopped going to the appointments, but the words had stuck. Rest, as if it were something you could purchase like land, as if you could sign papers and take ownership of calm. The fire that evening was small and efficient, built from deadfall oak that burned hot and clean. Garrett heated water for coffee in a steel cup blackened by 1,000 previous fires. He didn't bother with a meal. Appetite was something that came and went like weather, unreliable, not worth planning around. Kodiak lay near the fire, but not too near, sphinx-like eyes half closed but still processing. The flames painted moving shadows across his coat, turning black fur to bronze gold to ember. He didn't sleep the way pets slept. He rested the way professionals rested, in layers, the surface available for immediate response, while something deeper cycled down just enough to recover. "You ever wonder what we're doing out here?" Garrett asked quietly. Kodiak's ear rotated toward the sound. That was all the answer he offered. "Yeah," Garrett said. "Me neither." The stars came out one by one, then in clusters, then all at once, like someone had thrown a switch. The Milky Way stretched overhead in a river of light that Garrett hadn't seen since Afghanistan. Out here, away from cities and their borrowed glow, the universe showed itself honestly. Distant, indifferent, beautiful in the way that dangerous things were beautiful. Garrett was adding another piece of wood to the fire when Kodiak stood. Not quickly, not in alarm, but with a deliberateness that made Garrett's pulse tick up exactly 10 beats per minute. The dog's body had changed configurations entirely, muscles tightening, with quiet intention, head lifted, nose working air currents invisible to human senses. "What is it?" Garrett murmured. Kodiak didn't look at him. The dog's eyes were fixed on the darker stretch of forest beyond the clearing, where the pines grew thick and the starlight couldn't reach. His tail was low and still. That was wrong. A relaxed tail moved. A tense tail lifted. A still tail meant the dog was holding position against an instinct to act. Garrett set down his coffee and rose slowly, heart rate steady but attentive. His right hand drifted toward his hip, where a Sig Sauer .226 sat in a leather holster he'd worn for so long it had shaped itself to his body. He didn't draw. Not yet. But his thumb found the retention strap and unsnapped it with a quiet click that seemed loud in the settling dark. He followed the line of Kodiak's gaze. There was nothing obvious there. No movement, no sound he could isolate. Just trees standing exactly as trees should stand, layered in shadow, swaying slightly in wind he could feel on his face. But Kodiak was trained to detect things that weren't obvious, things that hid, things that waited. For a long moment, neither of them moved. Garrett had learned over years and scars that the absence of evidence was not evidence of absence. He'd learned that the most dangerous things didn't announce themselves. They arrived in silence and left in chaos, and the space between those two states was where men like him lived and sometimes died. "Talk to me, boy," he said quietly. Kodiak remained locked, every sense focused on that invisible threshold between the camp and whatever the forest was choosing not to reveal. The dog's breathing had changed shallow and controlled the way it changed when he was working a scent cone in hostile territory, when one wrong move meant detonation. Then, just as quietly as it had begun, the tension eased. Kodiak's muscles unlocked by degrees. His head lowered slightly. His tail gave one slow movement, side to side, a signal flag, indicating stand down. He turned to once glance back at the forest, as if making sure it understood the terms of engagement, then returned to his position by the fire. Garrett stood there for another minute, staring into the trees. His hand left the pistol. His breathing returned to baseline. Whatever that had been, it hadn't been a warning. It had been a reminder. The land was not empty. He sat back down, picked up his coffee, found it had gone cold. He drank it anyway. Waste was a sin his father had taught him to avoid, right up there with lying and breaking promises. The old man had died 8 years ago, emphysema from 40 years in a paint factory, and Garrett still heard his voice, sometimes dispensing wisdom in short declarative sentences that didn't allow for argument. Pay attention to what your dog tells you. A man's word is all he's got. Do the right thing even when nobody's watching. Simple rules, harder to follow than they sounded. The fire burned low. Garrett let it. He unrolled his sleeping bag inside the tent and lay on top of it rather than in it, because August in Minnesota was still warm, and because some part of him needed to be ready to move without the complication of zippers and fabric. Kodiak positioned himself just outside the tent entrance, not sleeping, not pacing, simply present. A guardian without orders, a companion without expectations. Garrett closed his eyes and listened to the night sounds. Wind, insects, the distant call of an owl. Normal sounds, safe sounds. The sounds of a place that had no memory of artillery fire, or the wet slap of a medevac's rotors, or the specific silence that followed when someone stopped screaming. He thought about the land he'd bought, 160 acres that nobody wanted, too restricted for development, too remote for convenience, too burdened with whatever history had made it cheap. $8,000. His last $8,000. Money from a disability check and a settlement, and the slow accumulation of months when he hadn't spent anything because there was nothing he wanted to buy. Money that should have gone toward rent in a city somewhere, toward a future that made sense on paper. Instead, he'd driven north until the roads ran out and bought a piece of ground that probably couldn't be sold for what he'd paid. The therapist would have asked why. Garrett didn't have an answer that fit into therapy language. He just knew that after 23 years of following orders and going where he was told and doing what needed to be done, he needed to be somewhere that didn't need anything from him. Somewhere he could rest. He drifted into something that wasn't quite sleep, hovering in that space where the body shut down, but the mind kept running perimeter. Old habits, old wiring, not something you turned off just because you wanted to. Sometime after midnight, he heard Kodiak shift position, the soft sound of paws on dirt, the quiet intake of breath that meant the dog was scenting something new. Garrett's eyes opened. Through the tense mesh window, he could see stars, could see the dark shape of Kodiak sitting upright, head turned toward the south, toward the section of property he hadn't explored yet. "What do you got?" Garrett whispered. The dog's ears rotated, but he didn't turn, didn't acknowledge the question. His entire focus was aimed at something beyond the camp, beyond the firelight's ghost out there in the dark, where the land kept its secrets. Garrett lay still and listened, heard nothing unusual, felt nothing wrong, but he'd learned to trust the dog's senses over his own trust, the equipment that evolution had built to detect things human beings had forgotten how to notice. After 5 minutes, Kodiak settled again. Whatever it was had passed or paused or decided to wait for better timing. Garrett didn't sleep after that. He lay in the tent with his hand on the pistol and listened to the night and thought about the envelope in the truck, the deed, the property description, the coordinates that had looked random on paper but had led him here to this specific piece of ground, to this clearing where the grass grew tall and the lake reflected stars, and something underneath the surface held its breath. He'd bought this land because it was cheap and empty and far from everything. But as the night wore on and the stars wheeled overhead and Kodiak maintained his silent vigil, Garrett began to suspect that empty was the wrong word. The land was full of something, full of history or memory or the kind of silence that came not from absence but from deliberate quiet. The kind of quiet men imposed when they needed to hide something. When dawn finally arrived, it came gently carried in on warm air and birdsong. The sky lightened from black to gray to a pale blue that promised heat. Garrett woke because waking at dawn was what his body did now, automatic as breathing trained into him by years of standing watch. He lay still for a moment assessing. No pain beyond the usual geography of old injuries. No immediate threats, just morning pressing in through canvas and the smell of dew on grass, and somewhere nearby the sound of Kodiak moving through his own morning routine. Garrett unzipped the tent and stepped out into air that tasted clean and new. The fire had died to ash. His coffee cup sat where he'd left it, half full of yesterday's cold brew. The clearing looked exactly as it had the night before, peaceful and ordinary, giving away nothing. Kodiak stood about 20 yards out, facing east, his body aligned with something Garrett couldn't see. Not tense, not alarmed, but focused, engaged. The dog's nose was down, moving slowly back and forth across a patch of ground that looked no different from any other patch of ground. Garrett walked over boots wet with dew, moving quietly out of habit. "What have you got, boy?" Kodiak glanced up briefly, then returned his attention to the earth. He pawed once at the grass, gently, more inquiry than excavation. Then he sat, stock still, eyes forward. The universal signal that meant contact, meant alert, meant something here requires attention. Garrett knelt beside him and studied the ground. At first he saw nothing, just grass, just soil, just the ordinary composition of earth in late summer. But then his eyes adjusted, started picking up the subtle differences that training taught you to notice. The grass here grew slightly differently, thinner, the color just a shade off from the surrounding vegetation. The ground itself felt firmer under his palm, as if something beneath it was resisting pressure. He inhaled slowly through his nose. There it was, faint. So faint he might have imagined it, a metallic tang light as breath barely present. But Kodiak wasn't imagining it. Kodiak's training had been built around detecting metal compounds, explosive residue, chemical signatures that human noses couldn't process. Whatever was down there, it was real enough for a military K-9 to identify. Garrett sat back on his heels thinking. This was his land, legally, officially. He had the papers. He could dig anywhere he wanted, disturb anything he chose. That was the whole point of ownership. But something in his gut said slow down, said pay attention, said this is the moment where you decide whether you're the kind of man who ignores warning signs or the kind who heeds them. He'd ignored warning signs once. In a warehouse outside Mosul, he'd seen something that didn't fit, felt something off, and chosen to follow orders instead of instinct. 3 men had paid the price for that choice. He looked at Kodiak, who looked back with amber eyes that held no judgment, only information. The dog had done his job. Now it was Garrett's turn to do his. Not today, or she. And done today, Garrett said quietly. We mark it and we wait. He pulled out the small notebook he kept sealed in plastic and sketched the location. Drew landmarks, noted the distance from the tent, the angle to the lake, the position relative to the tree line. He marked the spot with a piece of biodegradable surveying tape, bright orange, tied to a nearby sapling. Then he stood and walked away, leaving the ground undisturbed. Kodiak followed after a moment, casting one last look back at the marked spot, then falling into step beside Garrett. They moved together through the morning light, man and dog, both carrying questions neither could answer yet. The day was going to be hot. Garrett could feel it building in the air, pressure, rising humidity thickening. He should eat something, should drink more water, should do all the things that kept a body functional. Instead, he found himself walking toward the southern edge of the property, drawn by curiosity, and something else, something that felt like gravity or obligation. The land sloped gently downward here, the trees growing denser, pine giving way to birch and aspen. His boots found what might have been an old game trail, narrow and overgrown, but still visible if you knew how to look. Kodiak ranged ahead, then back, then ahead, again, reading the terrain in ways Garrett couldn't, processing information through senses that operated in spectrums human beings had abandoned when they started building cities. They'd gone maybe a quarter mile when Kodiak stopped. Not the alert posture from the night before. Something different, something sharper. The dog's entire body locked into position, head low, weight shifted back onto his haunches as if bracing against something unseen. His tail dropped to horizontal, his ears pinned forward. This was the posture Kodiak took when he'd found explosives. Garrett felt his chest tighten. He didn't speak right away. Years ago, he'd learned that sound could ruin a moment of clarity, could break whatever fragile connection allowed communication between species. He waited, letting the silence stretch until it felt deliberate, felt like a choice rather than an absence. "What do you have?" he asked quietly. Kodiak didn't look at him. The dog's amber eyes were fixed on something ahead through a gap in the trees where light fell differently, where the forest seemed to thin. Garrett approached slowly, careful not to crowd, scanning the ground for tripwires or pressure plates, or any of the 100 ways the earth could hide intention to harm. His training said clear the path. His instinct said trust the dog. He trusted the dog. Through the trees he saw it, a structure, man-made, deliberately concealed. A wooden canopy maybe 15 feet square, built from weathered beams that had aged to the same gray as the surrounding tree bark. The roof was angled just enough to shed rain and snow. Moss grew along the edges, softening the lines, blending the geometry into the organic chaos of the forest. From above, from a distance, it would look like nothing more than shadow. But from here, from this angle, with morning light hitting it just right, Garrett could see what the canopy was protecting. A rail car. Old, narrow, maybe 20 feet long. Its metal sides had dulled to a flat gray that absorbed light rather than reflecting it. It sat on rails that extended from beneath the canopy and disappeared into the earth, the tracks running straight and true, cutting through the forest floor with the kind of precision that didn't happen by accident. Garrett felt something cold move through his stomach. Not fear exactly, recognition, the shape of a secret. Railroad tracks didn't appear in the middle of nowhere. They required planning, engineering, purpose. They connected points. They moved things from one place to another, usually things that were heavy or valuable or both, or things that needed to disappear. He moved closer each step, deliberate eyes sweeping for signs of recent activity. No fresh tire marks, no footprints, no indication that anyone had been here in months, maybe years. But the canopy was sound. The beams were solid. Someone had built this to last, built it to protect whatever was inside that railcar from weather and time and casual discovery. Kodiak stayed close now, his professional distance collapsing into something more protective. The dog positioned himself slightly in front of Garrett, not blocking, just present, ready to intervene if whatever was ahead proved hostile. The railcar's door faced them, a sliding panel secured with a handle that had oxidized to the color of dried blood. Garrett reached for it, then paused. His hand hovered in the air 6 inches from contact while his mind ran through scenarios. This was his land. He had the legal right to open this door. But legal and wise weren't always the same thing. He pulled out a small bottle of oil from his pocket, applied a careful drop to the handle mechanism. Waited. The oil crept into the metal, seeking pathways, loosening the grip of time. 60 seconds. That's all it took for chemistry to do what force couldn't. Garrett gripped the handle and turned, adding steady pressure. The mechanism resisted, then surrendered with a groan that sounded almost organic, almost pained. The door slid open 6 inches, then 12, then wide enough for a man to enter. The smell hit him first. Not decay, not rot, just old air, metal and dust, and the particular scent of enclosed spaces where nothing had moved in a very long time. Light filtered through a narrow window near the ceiling, illuminating a compact interior arranged with military efficiency. A cast iron stove in one corner, its pipe sealed through the roof. A narrow table bolted to the floor, its surface scarred with marks that spoke of measuring, sorting, recording. This wasn't a shelter, it was a workspace. Garrett stepped inside, boots hollow on the metal floor. Kodiak followed, then immediately sat just inside the threshold, body aligned with the doorway. A boundary. The dog's eyes fixed on Garrett rather than exploring the space. That meant something. That meant be careful. The interior was maybe 8 feet wide, 10 feet deep. Spartan. Functional. Everything secured or mounted. A shelf held containers labeled in faded stencil. A cabinet was locked with a mechanism Garrett recognized from military supply units. The table had been used heavily. He could see the wear patterns where hands had rested, where tools had been placed again and again in the same positions. On the wall, a small metal placard caught the light. The lettering was worn but legible. Monitoring station. Do not disturb. Garrett felt his pulse tick up. Monitoring what? This land had been empty for as long as records showed. Conservation easement. Restricted development. Nothing here that needed monitoring unless someone had put something here that required watching. He moved to the cabinet and examined the lock. Military surplus, triple tumbler mechanism. Not something you opened without the key or serious tools. He had serious tools back at camp, but something told him to pause. To look. to understand before he acted. The table drew him. Its surface held scratches arranged in patterns. Straight lines, right angles, the kind of marks left by rulers and squares and instruments that measured with precision. He ran his fingers across them, feeling the grooves reading their story. Something had been brought here. Something had been measured. Something had been recorded, and then everything had been locked away. Garrett turned slowly, taking in the complete picture. The stove for heat, the table for work, the cabinet for storage, the monitoring equipment whose absence was louder than its presence would have been. This had been an active site. Someone had spent time here, days, maybe weeks, working, watching, waiting for something. Then they'd left, or been made to leave. The difference mattered. He stepped back outside, pulling the door closed but not sealed. The canopy above creaked softly in a breeze he could feel on his face. Kodiak rose and moved to his side, the protective distance restored now that they were clear of the confined space. "We need to map this," Garrett said. He pulled out his notebook and began to sketch. The canopy's dimensions, the railcar's orientation, the direction of the tracks. He marked trees for reference points, noted the slope of the ground, estimated distances with the practiced eye of someone who'd called in artillery strikes, using nothing but a compass and good geometry. When he finished, he had a serviceable diagram of the site. Not perfect, but enough to work from, enough to show someone if showing someone became necessary. The rails themselves drew his attention. He followed them south, away from the canopy, watching as they disappeared into the earth. Not buried deeply, maybe 8 inches of soil and vegetation, just enough to hide them from casual observation, just enough to let the forest reclaim its appearance of naturalness. He walked the line for 50 yards before it vanished completely under a thick mat of ferns and moss. Whoever had laid this track had known the land would do the rest of the work, would cover evidence with patience and leaves and the slow accumulation of seasons. Kodiak moved parallel to him, ranging out to check the perimeter. The dog showed no further alerts, but his attention remained focused. Not relaxed, not off duty, still working. Garrett turned back toward the rail car and noticed something he'd missed on approach. A depression in the ground near the canopy's rear corner. Subtle, regular. The grass there grew shorter, as if pressed down repeatedly over years. The kind of wear pattern that came from foot traffic or equipment placement, or something happening in the same spot enough times to alter the landscape. He knelt and examined it. The depression was roughly circular, maybe 3 feet across. The soil here felt different, denser, as if something had been placed here with enough weight to compact the earth beneath. Kodiak approached and sniffed the area once, then backed away. Not an alert, not a warning, just acknowledgement that yes, something had been here and no, it wasn't here anymore. Garrett marked the spot in his notebook, adding it to his growing collection of questions without answers. The sun had climbed higher now, burning off the morning cool. Sweat gathered under his collar. His stomach reminded him that he hadn't eaten since yesterday's energy bar. Basic maintenance. The body as machine. Fuel and water and rest, and it kept running. But Garrett wasn't ready to leave yet. Something about this place held him, some frequency he couldn't quite hear but could feel in his bones. The rail car, the monitoring station, the hidden tracks, the careful construction designed not to last forever but to last long enough. Long enough for what? He circled the entire canopy, studying the beams, checking the joints. Solid work, professional work. The kind of construction that spoke of budgets and specifications and someone checking off boxes on a compliance form. Not a private project, not some homesteader's dream. This had the fingerprints of an organization. Government or corporate, those were the only entities that built like this. Efficient, functional, designed to be forgotten. Garrett took one last look at the rail car, at the sealed door, with its fading warning placard, at the structure that held secrets the way mines held ore buried in waiting. "Let's go," he said to Kodiak. They walked back toward camp through the same trail they'd cut, coming in the jaw's rhythmic patrol, the man's steady pace. But everything felt different now. The land had shown its hand just barely, just enough to prove it was holding cards. By the time they reached the clearing, the sun stood almost directly overhead. Heat pressed down like a physical weight. The tent shimmered slightly in the bright light. Garrett's camp looked exactly as he'd left it, untouched and ordinary, except now he knew what lay a quarter-mile south, knew what his $8,000 had actually purchased. Not peace, not rest, not empty land where nothing ever happened. He'd bought a question, and the answer was buried under 40 years of silence and dirt and the careful work of people who understood that the best way to hide something was to make it look like there was nothing to find. Garrett sat on the fallen log and drank water straight from the pump. It was cold and clean and tasted like iron. Good water from deep aquifers filtered through stone and time, innocent of whatever had happened on the surface. He thought about the monitoring station. Thought about what needed monitoring badly enough to build a dedicated structure to run railroad tracks through forests to seal everything up and walk away. Then he thought about Kodiak's alert that morning. The way the dog had identified something in the ground. The metallic scent, the firm soil. The pieces started arranging themselves into patterns he didn't like. Garrett pulled out his phone. No signal. That was expected. He'd driven far enough north that cell towers were suggestions rather than guarantees. But he had names. He had numbers stored in offline contacts. People from before, people who might remember. People who owed him or who he owed the complicated arithmetic of brotherhood that didn't expire just because you signed discharge papers. He'd make the call. But not yet. First, he needed to understand what he was calling about. Needed to know if he was looking at old waste or active danger or something worse. Needed to decide if this was his problem or if he could seal the door and walk away and let the land keep its secrets. The sun beat down. Sweat ran down his spine. Kodiak lay in the shade, eyes half closed. But Garrett could see the dog's ears rotating, tracking sounds, maintaining awareness even in rest. Garrett's last $8,000, his last savings, his last attempt to find something like peace. And he'd bought ground zero of someone else's disaster. The irony was so sharp it almost made him laugh. Almost. Instead, he opened his notebook and began to write. Not poetry, not thoughts, just facts, observations, measurements. The kind of field report he'd written 100 times before in other countries, other contexts when knowing what happened mattered more than how you felt about it. The land spread out around him, beautiful and patient, and full of things that waited in the dark for men like him to find them. Garrett wrote until his hand cramped. And Kodiak watched the tree line, professional and alert, ready for whatever came next. The town of Pine Haven announced itself the way small northern towns always did, without ceremony or pretense. One moment Garrett was driving through unbroken forest, the next he was passing a faded sign that read, "Welcome to Pine Haven, population 1,847, founded 1889. The number had been painted over twice each time with a smaller figure, as if the town were slowly admitting defeat to time and economics, and the pull of cities 200 miles south. Main Street curved gently along the lake shore lined with buildings that had been there long enough to settle into themselves. A hardware store with a wooden porch that sagged slightly in the middle. A diner called the Northwoods with windows that reflected morning sun in sheets of gold. A post office sharing space with what looked like a bait shop. Everything weathered, everything functional, nothing designed to impress. Garrett had left Kodiak at camp with instructions to guard which the dog would interpret as lying in strategic shade while monitoring the perimeter. The drive had taken 20 minutes down roads that deteriorated from paved to gravel to something that might charitably be called maintained dirt. His truck fit in here looked like it belonged among the other vehicles parked at angles along the street, pickups and SUVs that bore the scars of actual work rather than the cosmetic damage of mall parking lots. He needed information, needed to understand what he'd found before deciding what to do with it. And information in small towns didn't come from internet searches or official databases. It came from people who'd lived long enough to remember when the official story and the real story diverged. The county records office occupied a squat brick building halfway down Main Street, wedged between a lawyer's office and a barber shop that advertised haircuts for $8. Garrett parked under a maple tree and sat for a moment, hands on the wheel, preparing himself for questions he didn't want to answer. The building's interior was exactly what he expected. Linoleum floors worn to pale streaks where foot traffic had passed for decades. Fluorescent lights humming their constant nervous song. The smell of paper and dust and the particular staleness of air conditioning that had been running since Carter was president. Behind a counter that looked like it had been salvaged from a high school, a woman looked up from a computer screen. Margaret Calloway was in her early 60s, tall and spare, with gray hair pulled into a practical knot at the base of her neck. She wore reading glasses on a chain and a cardigan despite the August heat. Her eyes were sharp and assessing, the kind that missed very little and forgot even less. "Help you?" she asked. Her voice carried the flat vowels of northern Minnesota words clipped short against the cold even in summer. "Need some information on a land parcel," Garrett said. "Just purchased it. Want to confirm boundaries and access." "Parcel number." He gave it to her, watched her fingers pause over the keyboard just for a heartbeat before she started typing. It was a small thing most people wouldn't have noticed, but Garrett had spent years reading body language and context where misreading got you killed. She knew something about his land. Margaret pulled up the file and studied the screen for longer than necessary. When she finally looked at him, her expression had shifted from professional courtesy to something more guarded. "You're the new owner," she said. "Not a question. Signed the papers 3 days ago. You know about the restrictions." "I know. Development setbacks, conservation easements, can't build within 300 feet of the eastern shoreline, can't extract minerals, can't subdivide." "I read the deed." Margaret leaned back in her chair, studying him the way a mechanic studies a car that's making the wrong kind of noise. She saw the field jacket, the boots, the military watch, the way he stood without leaning, balanced on the balls of his feet, ready for movement in any direction. "You a veteran?" she asked. "Navy." She nodded slowly as if confirming something she'd already suspected. "That parcel doesn't get many long-term owners. Most people sell within a year." "Why's that?" "Isolation. Restrictions. Hard to do anything with it." She paused. "Plus the history." Garrett waited. Silence was a tool. People filled silence with information they hadn't meant to share. Margaret glanced toward the door, then back to her screen. "Let me pull the full survey maps. Might take a few minutes." She disappeared into a back room that smelled like mildew and old adhesive. Garrett heard file cabinets opening, papers rustling, the small sounds of bureaucracy in motion. When she returned, she carried several rolled maps in a manila folder that looked older than most of the buildings on Main Street. She spread the maps across the counter, weighing the corners with smooth stones that probably served this exact purpose 50 times a day. The property lines were clear-marked in red ink that had faded to rust. Topography showed the slope toward the lake. The elevation changes the density of tree cover. Standard survey work. But there were gaps, blank spaces where information simply stopped. No utility easements marked, no historical overlays, no notations about previous use or environmental assessments, just clean white spaces like someone had taken an eraser to memory. "What's missing here?" Garrett asked, pointing to the empty sections. Margaret's mouth tightened. "Records from 2007 to 2010. Some kind of filing error during the county system upgrade. At least that's the official explanation." And the unofficial explanation? She met his eyes. Held them, making a decision about what kind of man he was and whether that kind of man could be trusted. "We had a flood in 2012, she said carefully. "Basement took on 4 feet of water, lost a lot of records. Some people say it was convenient timing. Some people say I'm too suspicious." She tapped the blank space on the map. "But I've worked here 32 years. I know what files we had, and I know what disappeared before that flood ever happened." Garrett felt something cold settle in his chest. Who would remove records? Someone with authority, someone with a reason. Margaret pulled off her glasses and cleaned them with the edge of her cardigan. When she put them back on, her eyes had softened slightly. "There was a project out there, government or corporate, I was never sure which. Started in the 80s, ran through 2009, then shut down overnight. No announcement, no explanation, just gone." "What kind of project?" "The kind people don't talk about." She lowered her voice. "You should talk to Dr. Iris Whitmore. She does independent geological surveys. Contract work for the EPA sometimes. If there's something odd about that land, she'll know it." Garrett committed the name to memory. "Anyone else I should speak with?" Margaret hesitated, then wrote 2 more names on a slip of paper. "Ranger Cole Brennan. He patrols the state forest that borders your property. And Walter Hayes, though he's getting on in years. Used to do mechanical work for various operations around the county. Doesn't talk much anymore, but if you catch him in the right mood, he remembers things." Garrett took the paper. "Thank you." "Don't thank me yet," Margaret said. "Sometimes ignorance is safer than knowledge." He was halfway to the door when she called out, "Mr. Ashford." He turned. She was watching him with an expression that might have been concern or might have been warning. "Be careful with that land," she said. "It has a way of asking questions people don't want to answer." The Northwoods diner smelled like coffee and bacon grease and the particular comfort of food that had been cooked the same way for 40 years. Garrett took a booth by the window where he could watch the street and ordered black coffee from a waitress who looked like she'd been serving coffee since the Kennedy administration. The town moved at the pace of a place where rushing accomplished nothing. Pickups pulled in and out of parking spaces. An old man swept the sidewalk in front of the hardware store with methodical precision. A woman pushed a stroller past the barber shop, moving through dappled shade in no particular hurry to be anywhere. Garrett pulled out his notebook and reviewed what he'd learned. The gaps in the record, the project that ended abruptly, the careful removal of information before any flood could claim responsibility. He was building a picture, but it was all negative space defined by what wasn't there rather than what was. He was on his second cup of coffee when the man entered. Von Merrick moved like someone accustomed to being welcomed. He was in his early 50s, tall and well-groomed, wearing a light gray suit that probably cost more than Garrett's truck. His dark hair was combed neatly back from a face that managed to look both friendly and completely impenetrable. He scanned the diner with the casual confidence of ownership. Then his eyes found Garrett and stopped. Recognition flickered across his features. Not surprise. Recognition. Merrick approached the booth with the smooth gait of a man who'd never been told no in any context that mattered. He stopped at the edge of the table, smiled, and extended his hand. "Mr. Ashford," he said, "I've been expecting you." Garrett didn't take the hand, just looked at it, then at Merrick's face, then back to his coffee. "We haven't met," Garrett said. "No, but I make it my business to know who's buying property in the area." Merrick withdrew his hand without apparent offense and gestured to the empty seat. "May I Free country." Merrick slid into the booth with practiced ease. Up close, Garrett could see the details that money bought. Manicured nails, perfect teeth, skin that had seen dermatologists and probably personal trainers and certainly never a day of actual manual labor. But his eyes were sharp and cold and utterly focused. "I represent a development group with interests in the region," Merrick said. "Sustainable growth, community-focused. We've been acquiring land near the lake for a conservation initiative. I'm not interested in selling. I haven't made an offer yet." "Still not interested?" Merrick smiled. It didn't reach his eyes. "You paid $8,000 for land you can't develop, can't subdivide, can't improve in any meaningful way. Forgive me for suggesting that a man in your position might be open to a generous buyout." "What position is that?" "A veteran on a fixed income, living alone, no family nearby, no prospects." Merrick leaned forward slightly. "I'm not trying to insult you, Mr. Ashford. I'm trying to help. That land is a burden, not an asset. Let me take that burden off your hands." Garrett set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "How do you know I'm a veteran?" "It's a small town. People talk. I've been here 40 minutes. Nobody knows me yet." Something flickered in Merrick's expression. A recalculation. He'd shown too much too fast, and they both knew it. "I did my research before approaching you," Merrick said smoothly. "Property records are public. Your name came up. A few phone calls filled in the details. Standard due diligence." "What phone calls?" "Does it matter?" Merrick pulled a checkbook from his jacket pocket. Expensive leather, gold trim. He clicked open a pen that probably cost more than Garrett's monthly disability payment. "I'm prepared to offer $50,000. Cash. We can close today. You walk away with enough money to start fresh somewhere more suitable." "Not selling." "75,000. "No." Merrick wrote a number on the check, tore it off, and slid it across the table. $100,000. Final offer. More than 10 times what you paid. Take it and find some place that actually has a future. Garrett looked at the check, looked at Merrick, looked past him to where the waitress was refilling coffee for an elderly couple, but who'd probably been coming to this diner since it opened. "Why do you want my land so badly?" Garrett asked quietly. "I told you, conservation initiative." "You're lying." Merrick's smile tightened. Some of the polish cracked. "Be careful with accusations like that." "I'm not accusing, I'm observing. You want that land for reasons you're not explaining, which means there's something there worth more than you're offering. There's nothing there but trees and restrictions. Then why are you here?" For a long moment they stared at each other across the table. The diner's ambient noise, the clatter of dishes, the murmur of conversation, the hiss of the grill seemed to recede into background static. This was the real conversation, the one happening beneath words. Merrick leaned back and his expression shifted into something harder. The friendly developer persona dropped away like a mask hitting the floor. "You have a daughter," he said softly. "Lena, 22 years old, Portland State University, political science major, lives off campus with 2 roommates, drives a 2011 Honda Civic blue license plate." "Stop talking." "She's got a bright future. Be a shame if anything interrupted that future." The threat hung in the air between them, naked and undeniable. Garrett felt the familiar cold settle into his spine, the combat readiness that never really left, just waited for moments like this to surface. Under the table, his hands unclenched slowly. He'd been half a second from breaking Merrick's nose. Years of training screamed at him to neutralize the threat. But this wasn't Iraq. This was a diner in Minnesota, and the threat was words, not bullets, and violence here would accomplish nothing except jail time. "You just made a mistake," Garrett said quietly. "Did I?" Merrick stood adjusting his suit jacket. "You have 48 hours to reconsider. After that, things get complicated. For you, for Lena, for anyone who gets in the way of progress." He dropped a $20 bill on the table. "Coffee's on me. Think about what I said. Think about what matters." Merrick walked out of the diner with the same smooth confidence he'd entered with. Through the window, Garrett watched him climb into a black Mercedes sedan and pull away, moving south back toward whatever hole he'd crawled out of. The waitress approached with the coffee pot. "You okay, hun? You look like you've seen a ghost." "I'm fine," Garrett said. "Just remembered something I need to do." Outside, he pulled out his phone and called Lena. She answered on the third ring, sounding breathless, like she'd been running. "Dad, what's wrong?" "Nothing's wrong. I just wanted to check in. How are classes?" "Classes don't start for 2 weeks. Are you okay?" "You never call just to chat." Garrett forced his voice to remain calm. "I'm fine. Listen, I need you to do something for me. I need you to pay attention to your surroundings for the next few days. If you see anyone following you, anyone taking pictures, anyone who seems out of place, I need you to call me immediately." Silence on the other end. Then, "Dad, what's going on?" "Probably nothing. Just humor me. This is about the land you bought, isn't it? I told you moving to the middle of nowhere was a bad idea." "Lena." "Fine, I'll pay attention, but you have to promise to tell me what's really happening." "I promise. Be safe." He ended the call and stood on the sidewalk watching traffic that barely qualified as traffic. 3 cars in 5 minutes. A world away from the chaos he'd known the cities where anonymity was currency and violence was Tuesday. But Merrick had found him, had researched him, had threatened his daughter in a tone that suggested the threat was backed by resources and willingness, which meant this was bigger than an unwanted land purchase, bigger than a simple buyout attempt. Someone was very concerned about what Garrett had found, concerned enough to threaten, concerned enough to move fast. Garrett walked back to his truck and was reaching for the door handle when he heard a low sound behind him. He turned. Kodiak stood 10 feet away, ears forward, body tense. The dog had followed him, had somehow tracked him from the camp to the town, covering miles of forest and road with the single-minded purpose of a professional who understood that his principal was in potential danger. "You're supposed to be guarding camp," Garrett said. Kodiak's response was to move between Garrett and the street where Merrick's Mercedes had disappeared. Protective positioning. The dog's amber eyes tracked the road, the buildings, the spaces between where threats might emerge. Then Kodiak's entire body language shifted. His head lowered. A sound came from deep in his chest, not quite a growl, more controlled than that. A warning shaped by training and restraint. Garrett followed the dog's gaze. Down the street near the barber shop, a man was watching them. He held a phone at chest level pointed in their direction, taking pictures or video. When he realized Garrett had spotted him, he lowered the phone and turned away, walking quickly toward a gray sedan parked in the shade. "Easy," Garrett murmured to Kodiak. "We're in public. Stay professional." The dog held position, but his muscles were coiled ready. The man climbed into the sedan and drove away, turning left at the stop sign heading south. Same direction as Merrick. Not a coincidence. Not surveillance for surveillance's sake. Merrick had people watching, had people documenting. Was building a file or preparing leverage, or simply making sure Garrett understood how seriously he should take the threat. Garrett opened the truck door. "Load up, boy." Kodiak jumped into the passenger seat, settling immediately, eyes forward, still alert. As Garrett pulled onto Main Street, the dog tracked every vehicle, every person, every potential threat with the systematic attention of a professional operator. They drove north, back toward the land, but Garrett's mind was already 3 moves ahead. Merrick knew about Lena, knew about Garrett's service, knew enough to make threats that had teeth, which meant Merrick had access to databases that weren't public, had connections that ran deeper than a simple development consultant should possess, government or corporate. Margaret had said she was never sure which. Maybe it was both. The ranger station sat a mile off the main highway, accessible via a dirt road marked by a small wooden sign that read, "Department of Natural Resources, Pine Haven District." Garrett had found the address in a phone book that looked like it had been printed when Reagan was president, sitting on a shelf in the diner. The station itself was a modest building, wood siding stained dark brown, a green metal roof surrounded by official vehicles and equipment sheds. A flagpole stood out front, the American flag and Minnesota state flag hanging limp in the afternoon heat. Cole Brennan was outside working on a chainsaw that had seen better decades. He was in his early 40s, built lean and weathered, wearing the green and khaki uniform of a state ranger. His hands were grease-stained and competent. He looked up as Garrett's truck pulled into the gravel lot. "Help you," Brennan called. Garrett climbed out, leaving Kodiak in the truck with the windows down. "Looking for information about the land I just bought. Margaret Calloway said you might be able to help." Brennan set down his wrench and wiped his hands on a rag. "Which parcel?" Garrett gave him the number. Watched recognition and something else, something like resignation, crossed the ranger's face. "The northern tract," Brennan said. "Yeah, I know it. Borders the state forest on two sides." He studied Garrett for a moment. "You former military Navy SEAL?" Brennan nodded. "Thought so. You've got that look. I did 2 tours in Afghanistan, Army Rangers. Got out in 2015. They shared a moment of silent understanding, the kind that only happened between people who'd seen similar things in different places. "Come on," Brennan said. "I'll show you something." He led Garrett behind the station to a large map mounted under plexiglass. The entire district was laid out in detail, color-coded for land use ownership ecological zones. Brennan tapped a section outlined in red. "This is your property. These red markers here are restricted access zones. I patrol the perimeter, but I'm not authorized to enter." "Why not?" "Above my pay grade. Orders came down about 15 years ago. Mark the zones, keep people out, don't ask questions." "I asked anyway when I first got posted here. Got told it was contamination remediation from old industrial activity. Sealed and monitored. Off limits." "What kind of contamination?" "They didn't specify. But I've walked those boundaries for 7 years now. I've seen the warning markers. The ones that are still standing." Brennan pulled out a ring of keys and unlocked a filing cabinet inside the station. He withdrew a folder and opened it to reveal photographs. The images showed metal posts driven into the ground. Each one bore a faded symbol, the trefoil radiation warning. "I'm not supposed to have these photos," Brennan said, "and I'm definitely not supposed to show them to civilians. But something about that land has never sat right with me, and if you're living there, you deserve to know what you're dealing with." Garrett studied the photographs. The posts looked old, weathered by decades of seasons. Some had fallen, some were barely visible through vegetation. But the symbol was unmistakable. "When were these taken?" 2 years ago, I did a boundary survey after a storm knocked down some trees. Found 5 posts along your eastern property line. I reported it through channels. Got told to mind my own business." "Who told you that?" "My supervisor, who got it from his supervisor. Chain of command all the way up to people I've never met." Brennan closed the folder. "Look, I don't know what was out there, but radiation warnings don't appear for no reason, and they don't get hidden unless someone wants them forgotten." Garrett felt pieces clicking together. The monitoring station, the rail car, the sealed records, the radiation markers. A picture was forming ugly and clear. "Can you show me where these posts are?" Garrett asked. Brennan hesitated, then nodded. "I'll do better than that. I'll take you there. Give me 10 minutes to close up." They drove in Conbor Brennan's DNR truck, leading Garrett following. Kodiak sat alert in the passenger seat, head turning to track their route, filing away landmarks the way he'd been trained to do in hostile territory. The access road was barely visible, more suggestion than trail. Brennan navigated it with practiced ease, 4-wheel drive, engaged pushing through brush that scraped along the truck's panels. They traveled maybe 2 miles before he stopped and climbed out. "This is the edge of the restricted zone," Brennan said. "Your property line is about 100 yards that way." They walked through dense undergrowth, Brennan leading Garrett, following Kodiak, ranging ahead with the systematic coverage of a trained scout. The land here felt different, heavier somehow, as if the earth itself was holding its breath. Brennan stopped at a small clearing. In the center, tilted at a 45-degree angle, stood one of the metal posts. The radiation symbol was still visible, though rust had claimed most of the paint. "This is the westernmost marker I found," Brennan said. "There should be 4 more running east along your property line. I only found 2 others still standing." Garrett approached the post and examined it. Government issue, standardized design. The kind placed by official crews following official protocols. This wasn't someone's prank or paranoid fantasy. This was real warning for real danger. Kodiak approached the post, sniffed once, then backed away, his training kicking in. The dog had been taught to detect explosive compounds, which often contained radioactive isotopes. Whatever residue remained here, it was enough to trigger recognition. "Your dog's trained for this," Brennan observed. "Military K9, explosive detection." And he doesn't like it. No, Garrett said quietly. He doesn't. They spent another hour walking the boundary, found one more post half buried, nearly invisible under decades of leaf litter. Each one told the same story. Something had been here. Something dangerous enough to warrant federal warning markers. Something that had been carefully, deliberately buried under bureaucracy and time. When they returned to the trucks, Brennan pulled out a business card and wrote a number on the back. "This is my personal cell," he said. "You find anything else, anything that doesn't feel right, you call me. I can't promise official help, but I can promise I'll answer." "Why are you helping me?" Brennan looked out toward the forest, toward the restricted zones he'd patrolled for years without understanding why. "Because I swore an oath to protect people," he said. "That didn't stop when I took off the Army uniform. And because something about this whole situation stinks. If there's contamination out there, if there's danger, people should know. They have a right to know, even if knowing is dangerous. Especially then." Garrett took the card. "Thank you. Don't thank me yet. You're about to make some powerful people very unhappy, and they tend to push back hard." On the drive back to camp, Garrett's phone buzzed. Text message. Unknown number. The message contained a photo. Lena walking across the Portland State campus. Taken that afternoon based on the angle of shadows. Close enough to show the pattern on her backpack. Close enough to show that whoever took it could have done much worse than photograph. Below the image, 4 words, 48 hours. Tick-tock. Garrett pulled over, hands shaking. Not from fear, from rage. Pure cold rage that he forced down through years of training, forced into the box where all dangerous reactions lived until they could be deployed strategically. Kodiak whined softly. The dog could smell the adrenaline, the change in Garrett's chemistry. Could sense the shift from calm to combat ready. "It's okay, boy," Garrett said, though his voice was tight. "We're okay." But they weren't okay. Merrick had escalated, had shown that his threats weren't empty, had proven he could reach Lena anytime he wanted. Garrett had 48 hours to decide what mattered more, his daughter's safety or whatever truth was buried under his land. It wasn't really a decision at all. He pulled back onto the road and drove toward Camp Mine, already working through options. He could sell, could take Merrick's money and walk away, could let whatever was buried stay buried. But then he thought about the radiation markers, thought about the monitoring station, thought about the careful erasure of records in the sealed cabinet, in the railroad tracks that ran to nowhere, thought about the fact that his land bordered a lake that fed into a river that fed into drinking water for towns downstream. If there was contamination, if there was danger, and he walked away without saying anything, then he was making the same choice he'd made in Mosul. The same choice that had put 3 men in the hospital and guilt in his chest for the rest of his life. Some mistakes you only got to make when on. Garrett reached camp as the sun touched the horizon, painting everything gold and red. The tent stood where he'd left it. The fire pit was cold. Everything normal. Everything peaceful. He sat on the log and pulled out his phone, scrolled through his contacts until he found a name he hadn't called in 3 years. Benjamin Shaw, former Navy liaison. The kind of man who knew people who knew people. The kind who understood that sometimes the official channels were compromised and you needed to go around them. The call connected on the 4th ring. "Garrett Ashford," Benjamin said, surprise threading through his voice. "Didn't expect to hear from you. Thought you'd disappeared into the wilderness for good." "I found something, Ben, something bad, and people are threatening my daughter to keep me quiet." Silence on the other end. "Then tell me everything." Garrett talked for 20 minutes. Described the railcar, the monitoring station, the radiation markers, Merrick's threats, the gaps in the records. He laid it all out in the clipped factual language of mission reports, no emotion, just data. When he finished, Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. "You're sitting on a contamination site," he finally said. "Probably military or defense contractor waste. Old enough that whoever dumped it is either dead or protected by statute of limitations. New enough that it's still dangerous. What do I do?" "Officially nothing, sell the land and walk away, forget you ever saw any of it. And unofficially, you document everything, you get samples. You build a case so airtight that when it goes public, nobody can bury it again." Benjamin paused. "But Garrett, going that route means you're declaring war on people with resources and no morals. They've already threatened Lena. They won't stop there." "I know. And you're still going to do it." It wasn't a question. "I'm still going to do it," Garrett confirmed. "Then you're going to need help, real help. I know some people at the EPA, good people who actually give a damn. Let me make some calls." "But Garrett." "Yeah. Once you start this, you can't stop halfway. You're either all in or all out. There's no middle ground with something like this. I understand. After the call ended, Garrett sat in the gathering dark and listened to the forest sounds. Kodiak lay at his feet, warm and solid and present. The kind of presence that reminded you that you weren't alone, even when you felt like you were carrying weight nobody else could see. 48 hours. Merrick had given him 48 hours to make a choice. But Garrett had already decided. Had decided the moment he saw that photograph of Lena. Had decided that some threats didn't deserve compliance. Some bullies needed to be confronted. Some secrets needed to be dragged into light, no matter how much darkness fought to keep them hidden. He would document everything, would gather evidence, would build the kind of case that couldn't be dismissed or buried or threatened into silence. And if Merrick wanted a war, Garrett would give him one, but not the kind Merrick expected, not the kind fought with violence or intimidation, the kind fought with truth, with witnesses, with evidence so overwhelming that denial became impossible. Garrett stood and walked to the tent. Inside his pack was the camera he'd carried through 4 deployments, waterproof, shockproof, designed to document war crimes and strategic intelligence. It would work just fine for documenting environmental crimes. Tomorrow he would go back to the railcar, would open that sealed cabinet, would photograph everything, would gather soil samples and water samples and anything else that could be tested in a laboratory by people who understood chemistry better than cover-ups. Tomorrow the real work would begin. But tonight he sat by a cold fire pit under stars that didn't care about human problems, with a dog who'd followed him into hell and back, and made peace with the fact that peace was always temporary. The land held its secrets, but not for much longer. Dawn arrived cold and gray, the kind of morning that felt like a held breath before something broke. Garrett woke to the smell of rain, coming ozone and earth, and the particular electricity that preceded storms. He lay in his sleeping bag for 30 seconds, running through the plan he'd built during the sleepless hours after midnight. Document everything. Gather samples. Contact the EPA through Benjamin's connections. Go public before Merrick could escalate further. Simple in theory, dangerous in execution. Kodiak was already awake, sitting just outside the tent, ears rotating to track sounds Garrett couldn't hear. The dog's posture was alert, but not alarmed. Professional vigilance. The forest was waking around them, birds negotiating territory, small animals moving through undergrowth, the ordinary business of survival playing out in 1,000 small dramas. Garrett dressed quickly, layering against the temperature drop. Field jacket over a thermal shirt, cargo pants with reinforced knees, boots laced tight. He checked his packed camera sample container's notebook, water the Geiger counter he'd requisitioned from a surplus dealer 3 years ago and never thought he'd actually need. The counter was old Soviet-made, built like a brick, and twice as reliable as the modern equivalents. He'd tested it yesterday on a smoke detector's amerithium source. It worked. That was all that mattered. "Ready to work?" he asked Kodiak. The dog's tail swept once. Affirmative. They moved through the forest as light gathered strength, following the path they'd cut 2 days before. The railcar sat exactly where they'd left it, unchanged, patient, holding its secrets the way the earth holds bones. Garrett approached it differently this time. Not with curiosity, with purpose. He photographed the exterior from 8 angles, documented the canopy structure, measured distances, created a visual record that could withstand courtroom scrutiny. Then he opened the door and stepped inside. The interior smelled the same. Old air, metal, time compressed into a space too small for the weight it carried. Garrett set up his camera on the table and began a systematic inventory. Every container, every label, every piece of equipment still mounted or stored. The locked cabinet drew him. It was military surplus triple tumbler mechanism, the kind designed to protect classified materials from enemy acquisition. Garrett had opened similar locks in places where asking permission wasn't an option. He pulled out his lockpick set, small tools that looked delicate but were spring steel wrapped in leather. It took him 4 minutes to defeat the mechanism. The tumblers fell into alignment with clicks that sounded too loud in the enclosed space. The cabinet door swung open. Inside were 12 glass containers, each sealed with wax and labeled in fading marker. Lake sample August 2009. Lake sample September 2009. The progression continued through early 2010, then stopped. The liquid in each container had an unnatural tint, greenish-blue, the color of antifreeze or chemical runoff. Below the samples sat a stack of rolled maps. Garrett lifted them carefully, spread them on the table. His chest tightened as the image resolved. Contamination plume modeling, the kind of maps environmental engineers created to predict how pollution spread through water systems. Ground zero marked at a point he recognized as being directly beneath the railcar. Concentric circles radiating outward like ripples from a stone thrown into still water. The outer circle reached the lake, reached the river that drained the lake, reached aquifers that fed wells for 3 townships downstream. Red zones marked areas of highest concentration, yellow for moderate, green for trace amounts. But even the green zones showed contamination levels above EPA safety thresholds. And this map was 15 years old. 15 years for the contamination to spread, to seep deeper, and to reach further. Garrett felt sick. He photographed everything, every map, every sample, every notation. His hands were steady, but his mind was racing through implications that multiplied like cancer cells. Beneath the maps, he found a notebook, handwritten entries in careful script, a scientist's documentation of slow-motion disaster. June 15, 2009. Uranium-238 levels at 420% of maximum allowable concentration. Cesium-137 detected. Organic compounds consistent with industrial degreasing agents. Recommendation, immediate remediation and public notification. June 22, 2009. Repeated recommendation to site supervisor. Told to continue monitoring only. No remediation authorized. July 8, 2009, levels increasing. Plume spreading faster than models predicted. Aquifer contamination now certain. Demanded emergency protocols be initiated. July 15, 2009. Meeting with project director. Informed that economic impact of disclosure would be unacceptable. Ordered to limit testing and maintain confidentiality agreement. August 3, 2009. Can no longer in good conscience remain silent. Submitting findings to EPA independently. The entry stopped there. Garrett flipped through the remaining pages. All blank. Whatever had happened after that final entry, the scientist hadn't been allowed to record it. He checked the signature on the inside cover. Dr. Helen Voss, environmental engineer. Garrett pulled out his phone and searched the name. Found an obituary from 2010. Dr. Helen Voss, age 43, died in a single vehicle accident on Highway 61 north of Duluth. Survived by her husband and 2 children. Service is private. The obituary was 3 paragraphs. Unremarkable, the kind that appeared in newspapers every day. Except Dr. Voss had been driving home from Minnesota when she died. Had been carrying evidence of contamination that could have shut down a project worth millions, maybe billions. Garrett felt the pieces arranging themselves into a picture he didn't want to see but couldn't ignore. He photographed the notebook, every page, every entry, every blank page after the entries stopped, because sometimes what wasn't written mattered as much as what was. Then he carefully returned everything to the cabinet except for 2 sample containers. Those he wrapped in foam padding and placed in his pack. Evidence, proof, the kind that laboratories could analyze and courts could admit and juries could understand. Outside, the sky had darkened. The promised storm was building clouds stacking up like fortress walls to the west. Garrett checked his watch. 9:30 in the morning. He had work to do before the rain arrived. The hatch in the railcar's floor was exactly where he'd expected it, hidden under a section of removable decking. He lifted the panels and stared down into darkness that smelled like concrete and old fear. A ladder descended into an underground chamber. Garrett clicked on his flashlight and started down counting rungs. 12 steps. The chamber opened up at the bottom, roughly 15 feet square concrete walls sealed with industrial coating that had mostly held against time and moisture. Steel drums lined one wall, 43 of them, each marked with hazard symbols that needed no translation. Radioactive material, toxic waste, corrosive chemicals. The complete catalog of industrial poisons sealed in containers that were never designed for permanent storage. Several drums showed rust. 2 had visible cracks. 1 had a slow seep of dark fluid pooling beneath it. Garrett photographed everything, documented the serial numbers on each drum, measured the dimensions of the chamber, took readings with the Geiger counter that climbed steadily as he approached the drums, peaking at levels that meant exposure time needed to be measured in minutes, not hours. This was the source, the ground zero marked on Dr. Voss's maps. 43 drums of death buried under his land, leaking slowly into the water table, spreading poison through an ecosystem that fed into human systems downstream. How many people had drunk this water over 15 years? How many children had swum in the lake? How many families had eaten fish that bioaccumulated toxins season after season? Garrett climbed back up the ladder, pulse elevated not from exertion but from rage. Cold, controlled rage that he channeled into documentation. More photographs, more measurements, more evidence. When he finally sealed the rail car and emerged into pre-storm gloom, Kodiak was waiting exactly where he'd been left, but the dog's posture had changed. Head high, ears forward, eyes fixed on the trail back toward camp. "What is it?" Garrett asked. Kodiak didn't move, didn't acknowledge the question. His entire body had become an arrow pointing toward something Garrett couldn't see yet, but the dog had already identified. Then Garrett heard it. Voices, distant but approaching. Multiple people moving through the forest without particular concern for stealth. He moved quickly, quietly, positioning himself behind the rail car, where he could observe without being immediately visible. Kodiak flowed to his side, professional and silent, reading the situation and adapting without orders. Three men emerged from the tree line. They weren't dressed for hiking, business casual, clean boots, carrying tablets and phones instead of backpacks. Two of them looked like hired muscle, thick-necked and alert. The third was leaner, older, carrying himself with the confidence of authority. They stopped 20 feet from the rail car. The older man pulled out his phone and made a call. "We're at the site," he said. "Railcar's intact. No signs of recent disturbance." A pause. "Yes, sir, Mr. Merrick. I'll confirm and send photos." Garrett felt ice water replace the blood in his veins. Merrick had sent people to check the site, to verify what Garrett had found, maybe to destroy evidence before it could be used. The older man approached the rail car, tried the door, found it unlocked. His expression shifted to concern. "Door's open," he said into the phone. "Someone's been inside recently. Dust patterns are disturbed." Garrett couldn't hear Merrick's response, but he saw the man's face harden. "Understood. We'll sanitize the site and remove any compromising materials." 2 hours. The call ended. The older man gestured to the muscle. "Get the truck. We're pulling the samples and anything else that could be tested. Burn the notebooks. If there's any paper trail in there, it disappears today." They were going to destroy the evidence, going to erase Dr. Voss's documentation, going to make sure that what Garrett had found could never be proven. Garrett had maybe 30 seconds to make a decision. Stay hidden and let them destroy everything, or step out and confront them. 3 against 1, but he had surprise and training and a Sig Sauer he desperately didn't want to use. Before he could move, Kodiak made the decision for him. The dog stepped into view, not charging, not aggressive, but undeniably present. 75 pounds of trained muscle and absolute confidence, placing himself between the men and the rail car. All three men froze. "What the hell?" one of the muscle guys muttered. "It's just a dog," the older man said, but his voice carried uncertainty, probably a stray. Kodiak's response was to sit perfectly still, eyes locked on the older man. Not a stray's behavior, a working dog's behavior, the behavior of a K9 who'd been given a position to hold and would hold it until death or release. The older man pulled out his phone again. Before he could dial, Garrett stepped out from behind the rail car. "That's far enough," he said quietly. 3 heads swiveled toward him. Garrett kept his hands visible, empty, non-threatening. But his stance was balanced, ready, the posture of someone who knew exactly how fast he could draw and fire if circumstances demanded. "You're Ashford," the older man said. "Not a question. This is my land. You're trespassing. Mr. Merrick sent us to inspect the site. We have legal authority." "Show me the warrant." The older man's jaw tightened. "We don't need a warrant. This is a secured environmental site under federal jurisdiction." "Then show me the federal documentation authorizing entry. Show me EPA credentials. Show me anything that proves you're not just hired thugs on private property." Silence, the kind that confirmed everything Garrett suspected. "You need to leave," the older man finally said. "This doesn't concern you. I found 43 drums of toxic waste under my land, contamination maps, evidence of a cover-up. It absolutely concerns me." The muscle guys shifted hands, moving toward jackets where weapons probably waited. Garrett's right hand drifted casually toward his hip. Kodiak remained motionless, a statue of controlled violence, waiting for release. "Nobody needs to do anything stupid," Garrett said. "You're going to leave. You're going to tell Merrick that the evidence is already documented and secured, and you're going to explain that if anything happens to me or my daughter, that evidence goes to every news outlet and federal agency I can reach." "You're making a mistake," the older man said. "No, the mistake was made 15 years ago, when someone decided profit mattered more than people. I'm just cleaning up the mess." For 10 seconds that felt like 10 hours, everyone stood perfectly still. Wind moved through the trees, Thunder rumbled in the distance. Rain was coming. The older man broke first. He gestured to his people. "Let's go. This isn't over." "Yes," Garrett said quietly. "It is." They backed away slowly, maintaining eye contact, professional enough to know you didn't turn your back on someone who'd already demonstrated tactical awareness. When they reached the tree line, they turned and disappeared into the forest. Garrett waited another 5 minutes, listening to the sound of their vehicle starting driving away, fading into distance. Only then did he relax slightly. "Good boy," he said to Kodiak. The dog's tail swept once, then returned to neutral. "Still on duty? Still alert." Garrett pulled out his phone and called Benjamin Shaw. "They just tried to destroy the evidence," Garrett said without preamble. "Merrick sent people to sanitize the site. I need EPA here now, today, before they come back with more people and less restraint." "I'll make the calls," Benjamin said. "But Garrett, you need to get somewhere safe. If they're willing to destroy evidence in broad daylight, they're willing to do worse." "I'm not leaving. This is my land." "Then at least get your daughter somewhere secure. If they can't pressure you directly, they'll go through her." Garrett's stomach dropped. He'd been so focused on the immediate threat that he'd forgotten Merrick's original leverage. He called Lena. No answer. Called again. Voicemail. His third call went through. "Dad, I'm in class. I can't." "Get out of class right now. Pack a bag and drive to Sarah's place in Seattle. Don't tell anyone where you're going. Don't post on social media. Just go." "What's happening?" "I'll explain later. Please, Lena. Trust me. Go now." Silence. Then, "Okay, I'm leaving now." The relief was physical. "Thank you. Call me when you're on the road." He ended the call as the first drops of rain began to fall. Large, cold drops that hit like warnings. The storm was here. Garrett and Kodiak made it back to camp just as the sky opened up. Rain fell in sheets, turning the forest into a gray blur, drumming on the tent with the sound of 1,000 fingers tapping. Garrett sat inside, reorganizing his evidence, checking and rechecking that everything was documented, backed up, ready to be handed to people who could actually do something with it. His phone buzzed. Text message. Unknown number. The message contained a video, 30 seconds long, shaky footage of the railcar, of Garrett's truck parked nearby, of Garrett himself standing beside Kodiak taking photographs. They'd been watching, had documented him documenting them. Were building their own case, their own leverage, their own version of events. Below the video, you have 12 hours, sell the land, or everyone sees this video with context that makes you look like an eco-terrorist trespassing on federal property. The timeline had shifted. Merrick had given him 48 hours yesterday. Now it was 12. Something had changed. Something had made them panic. Garrett thought about the confrontation at the railcar, about Merrick's men finding the door unlocked, about them realizing someone had accessed the evidence before they could destroy it. They knew he had samples, knew he had photographs, knew their window for damage control was closing fast. 12 hours. Enough time to make one final threat. Not enough time for Garrett to organize a proper response through official channels. Or so they thought. He called Benjamin Shaw again, explained the new threat, sent him copies of everything he'd documented. "I'm uploading all of this to secure cloud storage," Benjamin said. "Multiple copies, multiple locations. If they try to paint you as the villain, we'll release everything, show the timeline, show who tried to cover what up and when. Will it be enough? It'll have to be. The EPA team is mobilizing. They'll be at your location by tomorrow morning. Federal authority, federal jurisdiction. Once they're on site, Merrick loses his ability to control the narrative. That's 18 hours from now. A lot can happen in 18 hours. And then you need to stay alive for 18 hours. Can you do that?" Garrett looked at Kodiak, who was lying near the tent entrance, watching the rain, ears rotating to track sounds that passed below the storm's roar. "Yeah," Garrett said. "I can do that." The rain continued through the afternoon, heavy enough to turn the forest floor into a network of temporary streams. Garrett used the time to prepare. He loaded his pack with evidence, essentials, and emergency supplies. Created a bug-out plan if evacuation became necessary. Identified 3 routes away from camp, memorized landmarks, prepared for the possibility that staying might stop being an option. Kodiak watched him work with the patient attention of a professional who understood that preparation was the difference between survival and disaster. At 4 in the afternoon, the rain stopped as suddenly as it had begun. Clouds broke apart, revealing patches of pale sky. Steam rose from wet earth, creating ground fog that drifted through the trees like ghosts. Garrett was checking his phone for the third time when he heard it. A sound that didn't belong. Not an engine, not footsteps, something else. Crying, a child crying. He moved to the edge of Camp Kodiak, instantly alert beside him. Through the trees, maybe 100 yards toward the lake, he saw movement. Two small figures. Children. Garrett's chest tightened. He grabbed binoculars from his pack and focused. Two boys, maybe 8 or 9 years old, both wearing t-shirts and shorts despite the temperature drop. One was limping badly. The other had his arm around his friend's shoulders, trying to help him walk. They were headed straight for the restricted zone near the lake shore, the zone where the contamination plume was strongest. "Stay," Garrett commanded. Kodiak then reconsidered. "No, come." They moved quickly through the wet forest, closing the distance. As they got closer, Garrett could see the details that made his stomach turn. Both boys were pale. Too pale. The limping one had a bandage on his leg that showed signs of infection, angry red spreading from the edges. The other boy's lips had a bluish tint that spoke of poor circulation, or worse. These kids were already sick, already showing symptoms. "Hey," Garrett called out, "stop right there." The boys turned startled. The one helping his friend nearly dropped him. Garrett raised his hands, showing he wasn't a threat. "It's okay, I'm not going to hurt you. But you need to stay away from the lake. It's not safe." "We're just going fishing," the limping boy said, his voice weak. "We come here all the time." "How long have you been fishing here?" "All summer," the other boy said. "Why are we in trouble?" Garrett's mind raced. All summer, 3 months of exposure, swimming in contaminated water, eating fish that had absorbed toxins. These kids were walking casualties of a crime that had been covered up for 15 years. "What's your name?" Garrett asked the limping boy gently. "Ethan. Ethan Dwyer. This is my friend, Marcus." "Ethan, I need you to listen carefully. The water in this lake is contaminated. It's making you sick. That's why you're limping. Why you feel tired all the time. Why your leg won't heal properly." Ethan's eyes widened. "How did you know about my leg?" "Because I found what's causing it, and I'm getting people to fix it. But right now, I need you both to come with me. I need to take you to the hospital." "Our moms are going to be so mad," Marcus said. "Your moms are going to be grateful you're alive." Garrett pulled out his phone, praying for signal. One bar. Enough. He dialed 911. "This is Garrett Ashford. I'm on the northern track near Lake Whitmore. I have two boys approximately 8 years old showing signs of radiation exposure and chemical contamination. I need ambulances, and I need them now." The dispatcher's voice crackled. "Sir, did you say radiation exposure?" "Yes, these children have been swimming in contaminated water. They need immediate medical attention and decontamination protocols. Ambulances are on the way. Stay on the line." Garrett stayed on the line, kept the boys calm, kept them away from the lake. When he looked down at Ethan's leg, he could see the infection spreading in real time, angry red lines creeping toward the knee. This was what Merrick had been protecting. This was the cost of silence. Not abstract numbers on contamination maps. Real children with real poison in their blood. Kodiak moved close to Ethan and lay down beside him. The boy reached out tentatively and touched the dog's head. Kodiak pressed gently against the touch, offering comfort the only way he knew how. The ambulances arrived 20 minutes later, lights flashing, paramedics moving with efficient urgency. They asked questions Garrett answered as best he could, documented symptoms, took preliminary vitals that made the senior paramedic's face go pale. "We need hazmat protocols," she said into her radio. "Possible radiological exposure. Contact the regional hospital and prep the decontamination suite." Ethan's mother arrived just as they were loading him into the ambulance. Rachel Dwyer was in her mid-30s, wearing scrubs that suggested she'd come straight from work. When she saw her son on the stretcher, she made a sound no parent should ever have to make. "What happened?" she demanded. "Ethan, baby, what's wrong?" "Ma'am," the paramedic said gently, "your son has been exposed to contaminated water. We're taking him to the hospital for treatment." "Contaminated the lake. We've been swimming there for years. The county says it's safe." Garrett stepped forward. "The county is wrong. I found evidence of toxic waste contamination. Your son has been poisoned. So have other children who've used this lake." Rachel's legs buckled. Another paramedic caught her, helped her into the ambulance beside her son. As the vehicles pulled away, sirens fading into distance, Garrett stood in the settling quiet and felt the full weight of what he'd discovered. This wasn't about property values or corporate liability anymore. This was about children dying slowly while people who knew the truth chose profit over lives. He pulled out his phone and called Benjamin Shaw. "I just sent 2 kids to the hospital with radiation poisoning." Garrett said, his voice tight. They've been swimming in the lake all summer. One of them can barely walk. Ben, this is bigger than we thought. This is a public health crisis. How many other kids? I don't know, but this is a local swimming spot. Could be dozens. Could be more. Benjamin was quiet for a long moment. I'm calling every contact I have. EPA, CDC, FBI. This stops today. No more waiting for morning. They're coming now. Good, Garrett paused. And Ben, I want Merrick charged with attempted murder. Those kids are victims of his cover-up. Already working on it. The call ended. Garrett looked at Kodiak, who was watching him with amber eyes that held no judgment, only loyalty. We're doing this, Garrett said quietly, all the way, no matter what it counts. The dog's tail moved once against the wet ground. Agreement. Partnership. The bond between a man and the animal who'd followed him into hell and back. They returned to camp as evening gathered. The forest was quiet, washed clean by rain, waiting. Garrett built a small fire and made coffee that tasted like metal and determination. His phone buzzed constantly. Messages from Benjamin with updates. News that federal teams were mobilizing. Confirmation that the hospital had activated contamination protocols. And one message that made his blood run cold. Unknown number. A photograph of Lena's car on Interstate 90 heading east towards Seattle. The photo was timestamped 20 minutes ago, close enough to read her license plate, close enough to see her profile through the window. Below the image, last chance. Sell now or she has an accident tonight. Garrett stared at the message, feeling rage and fear compete for dominance. They were still pushing, still threatening, even knowing federal authorities were coming, even knowing their cover-up was collapsing. They were willing to hurt his daughter to maintain control. He had a choice to make. Sell the land, take the money, protect Lena, let the evidence disappear into legal settlements and non-disclosure agreements. Or fight, risk everything. Trust that the system would protect his daughter while he finished what Dr. Voss had started. Garrett thought about Ethan in that ambulance, thought about the infection spreading up his leg, thought about Marcus with his blue lips and all the other children who trusted that the adults in charge would keep them safe. He thought about Dr. Voss, 43 years old, dying on a highway because she'd tried to tell the truth. He thought about his own silence in Iraq, the warehouse, the 3 men who'd paid the price for his compliance. Not again. Never again. Garrett opened his phone and launched Facebook Live, pointed the camera at himself, waited for viewers to connect. 10, 20, 50, 100. My name is Garrett Ashford, he said calmly. I'm a Navy SEAL veteran. 3 days ago, I bought land in northern Minnesota with my last $8,000. What I found buried under that land is 43 drums of toxic waste that have been poisoning children for 15 years. The viewer count climbed 200, 300. Right now, someone is threatening to kill my daughter if I don't stay quiet about what I found. They've already sent me photos of her car on the highway. They want me to sell this land and sign a non-disclosure agreement so they can keep covering up environmental crimes. 500 viewers, 600. Garrett held up his phone showing the threatening text message to the camera. This is what corporate murder looks like in 2024. Not guns, not violence, just money and lawyers and threats against families. He showed the photos of the contamination maps, the drums, Dr. Voss's notebook entries. Dr. Helen Voss tried to expose this in 2009. She died in a convenient car accident. Today I sent 2 children to the hospital with radiation poisoning. Ethan Dwyer, 8 years old, can barely walk because he's been swimming in water contaminated by waste that was supposed to be safely stored. 1,000 viewers, 1,500. The man behind this cover-up is named Vaughn Merrick. He's a development consultant who's been managing this contamination site for a corporation I'm still working to identify. He's threatened me, he's threatened my daughter. And right now, he thinks he can make this all go away with money and intimidation. Garrett looked directly into the camera. Mr. Merrick, if you're watching this, understand something. I'm not like Dr. Voss. She was alone. She was trying to work within a system that betrayed her. I'm a SEAL. I know how to fight. And I have 2,000 people watching this live stream who are going to make sure that if anything happens to me or my daughter, your face is the first one they remember. The viewer count hit 3,000. The EPA is coming tomorrow. They're going to test everything I found. They're going to confirm the contamination. And then you're going to prison for what you did to Dr. Voss, for what you did to Ethan and all the other children you poisoned. This ends now, tonight. In front of witnesses you can't threaten or buy off. Garrett was about to continue when Kodiak's posture changed. The dog stood body tensing, ears pinned forward, not toward the forest, toward the access road. Through the trees, Garrett saw lights, multiple vehicles, coming fast. "We have company," Garrett said to the camera. "Keep watching." He propped his phone against a log, keeping the stream running, and stood. His hand drifted to the Sig Sauer at his hip. Kodiak moved to his side, professional and ready. 5 vehicles rolled into the clearing. SUVs expensive. The doors opened and men emerged. Garrett counted 8 total. 7 looked like security contractors. Tactical gear, professional bearing. Hands near weapons, but not drawing. The 8th man was Vaughn Merrick. He wore an expensive rain jacket over his suit, looking completely out of place in the forest, but perfectly comfortable commanding men with guns. His eyes found the phone, saw the live stream counter climbing past 4,000 viewers, and his expression shifted from confident to concerned. "Mr. Ashford," Merrick said loud enough for the phone to pick up, "we need to talk." "Then talk. 4,000 people are listening." Merrick's jaw tightened. This wasn't the private confrontation he'd planned. This was public, recorded, viral. "Turn off the camera and we can discuss this reasonably." "I'm done being reasonable. I found 43 drums of toxic waste. I found Dr. Voss's documentation. I sent 2 poisoned children to the hospital today. There's nothing to discuss except how long you're going to prison." "Those are serious accusations without proof." Garrett laughed. It wasn't a pleasant sound. "I have photographs. I have samples. I have contamination maps in Dr. Voss's handwriting. I have soil samples that will test positive for uranium and cesium. I have witness testimony from county officials about missing records. What proof would you like me to add?" Merrick took a step forward. His security team mirrored the movement, closing distance in a coordinated pattern that spoke of training and bad intentions. Kodiak responded with a sound that was deeper than a growl, a warning issued from the chest of a dog who'd been trained to engage armed combatants. The lead security contractor met Kodiak's eyes, and whatever he saw there made him pause. "Your dog can't stop all of us," Merrick said. "No," Garrett agreed, "but he can stop you, and that's good enough." The viewer count hit 5,000. Garrett could see comments scrolling past, people screen recording, people sharing the stream, people calling law enforcement. The power of documentation in real time. 5,000 witnesses, Merrick. Say what you came to say." Merrick's face flushed red. His carefully constructed corporate facade was cracking. "You have no idea what you're interfering with. This project was sanctioned at the highest levels, approved by people who understood the economic necessities of the time. You're a nobody with a mental health history trying to destroy a legitimate remediation effort. Remediation, you buried 43 drums of poison and pretended they didn't exist for 30 years. We were monitoring the situation. Dr. Voss was monitoring the situation. You killed her to shut her up. That's slander." But Merrick's voice wavered. He'd said too much, revealed too much. The stream was capturing everything. Garrett pressed the advantage. "Tell them about the phone calls, about the fixer you hired, about the brake lines that were cut on Dr. Voss's car." "You can't prove any of that." "I don't have to. The FBI will. They're already investigating her death as a homicide. Your phone records are going to bury you." That's when Merrick broke. His hand came up in a sharp gesture, and his security team moved. But they didn't get far. Sirens erupted from 3 directions. Federal vehicles' lights blazing roared into the clearing. FBI, EPA, U.S. Marshals. A coordinated response that Benjamin Shaw had orchestrated while Garrett kept Merrick talking on camera. Agents poured out of vehicles, weapons-drawn voices overlapping in commands that left no room for interpretation. Federal agents' hands where we can see them. On the ground now, nobody move. Merrick's security team froze, professional enough to know when they were outgunned, smart enough to know that resisting federal agents was a career-ending move. They complied, hands raised, weapons untouched. Merrick stood alone, his expensive suit and polished shoes suddenly ridiculous in the mud and chaos. An FBI agent approached him, credentials displayed. "Vaughn Merrick, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, and conspiracy to commit environmental crimes. You have the right to remain silent." Garrett's live stream captured it all, the handcuffs clicking shut. Merrick's face pale and shocked as he was led to a federal vehicle. The EPA teams moving toward the Railcar site with testing equipment. The U.S. Marshals securing the perimeter. The viewer count had reached 8,000. Garrett picked up his phone, turned the camera to face himself. This is what accountability looks like. This is what happens when one person refuses to stay silent. Dr. Helen Voss tried to save lives 15 years ago. Tonight, we're finishing what she started. He ended the stream. The phone buzzed immediately with calls, texts, messages, news outlets, reporters, people wanting interviews. Garrett ignored them all except one. Lena. Dad, what the hell is happening? Your video has 500,000 views. People are saying you took down a CEO on livestream. Are you safe? Are you in Seattle? Yes, I'm at Sarah's. Dad, are you okay? Garrett looked around at the organized chaos. Federal agents everywhere. Hazmat teams preparing to excavate the contamination site. Justice slow and imperfect, but real finally arriving. Yeah, he said. I'm okay. Better than okay. I'll explain everything tomorrow. Just stay where you are and stay safe. I'm proud of you, Dad. Those 4 words hit harder than anything else that day. Thanks, baby. I love you. He ended the call as Benjamin Shaw emerged from one of the FBI's vehicles, looking exhausted but triumphant. You did it, Benjamin said. You actually pulled it off. 8 million views and climbing. Every news outlet in the country is picking up the story. Merrick's company is in free fall. Their stock dropped 40% in the last hour. What about the kids? Hospital called. Ethan and Marcus are stable. They're starting chelation therapy to remove heavy metals from their blood. The CDC is setting up a screening program for every child who's used the lake in the last 5 years. How many? Initial estimates say 40 to 50 families. Could be more. Benjamin paused. But because of you, they're going to get treatment. They're going to get monitoring. They're going to have a chance. An EPA investigator approached a woman in her 40s with tired eyes and dirt under her fingernails. Dr. Iris Whitmore. She'd been part of the team that arrived, though. Mr. Ashford, she said, I've done preliminary testing on your samples. Uranium-238 at 400% of safe levels. Cesium-137. PCBs, industrial solvents. This is one of the worst contamination sites I've seen in 20 years. Can it be cleaned up? It has to be. The alternative is evacuating 3 townships and declaring the whole area uninhabitable. She looked at him with something like awe. You saved lives today. A lot of them. If this had gone another 5 years without remediation, we'd be looking at cancer clusters that would make Love Canal look minor. Garrett nodded slowly, too tired to feel much beyond relief. There's something else you should know. Dr. Helen Voss documented all of this in 2009. She tried to report it. They killed her for it. Iris's expression hardened. I've read her notebook. It's brilliant work. Meticulous documentation. She knew exactly what was happening and exactly how bad it would get. We're going to make sure her name is on everything. The cleanup project, the memorial, the new contamination protocols we developed from the site. She deserves to be remembered. The night wore on. Federal investigators interviewed Garrett for 3 hours, recording every detail. The contamination maps, Dr. Voss's notebook, the confrontation with Merrick's men, the live stream. Everything documented, verified, added to an evidentiary file that would eventually become thousands of pages. By midnight, the site was secured. Fences went up around the hot zones, guards were posted. Garrett's land had been transformed from a private refuge into a federal contamination site, but he felt no regret. Some things mattered more than property rights. As the last of the federal vehicles pulled away, Garrett sat by his cold fire pit with Kodiak at his feet. The dog had been on high alert for 12 hours straight, but now finally he relaxed, lay down with a sigh that seemed to release months of tension. Garrett's phone buzzed. Text from Benjamin. News from the hospital. They found 12 more kids with symptoms, all from families that use the lake, all under age 10. CDC is declaring it a public health emergency. Full screening for everyone within 5 miles. You started something big. Garrett stared at the message. 12 more children. 12 families who trusted that their government was protecting them. 12 lives damaged by choices made in boardrooms by people who'd never had to live with the consequences. But they were being helped now, being treated, would survive because someone had finally spoken up. He thought about his $8,000, his last savings, the money he'd spent on land that had brought nothing but danger and complications and sleepless nights. Best money he'd ever spent. The stars were out now, visible through gaps in the clouds. The same stars that had watched civilizations rise and fall, that had seen every human drama play out in miniature against the backdrop of geological time. Indifferent, eternal. Witnesses to everything and judges of nothing. Garrett closed his eyes and let exhaustion take him, knowing that tomorrow would bring more questions, more interviews, more complications. But tonight he'd done enough. He'd stood up when it mattered. He'd refused to look away. He'd chosen truth over comfort and justice over safety, and that he thought as sleep claimed him was all anyone could ask of themselves. The morning came with autumn clarity, cold and bright. Garrett woke to find Kodiak gone from his usual position. He sat up momentarily alarmed, then saw the dog sitting at the edge of camp staring into the forest with an expression that might have been contemplation. Garrett joined him. Together they watched the sun climb through the trees, painting everything gold and new. "We did it, boy," Garrett said quietly. Kodiak's tail moved once, not celebration, just acknowledgement of a job completed. Over the next 3 days, the story exploded across national media. Garrett's live stream had been viewed 20 million times. News crews descended on Pine Haven. Reporters camped outside the hospital where Ethan and the other children were being treated. Environmental activists called it the biggest contamination cover-up since Flint. And then on the 4th day, someone knocked on Garrett's tent at dawn. He opened the flap to find an elderly woman standing there leaning heavily on a cane. She was in her late 70s with white hair and eyes that had cried too many tears. "Mr. Ashford," she said, "my name is Eleanor Price. I need to confess something." Garrett invited her to sit by the fire he'd just started, made coffee, waited while she gathered the courage to speak. "I worked in the county records office," Eleanor began, her voice shaking. "In 1998, my husband was an engineer on the contamination project. He got lung cancer, died in 2002. They paid us to stay quiet, paid for his treatment, paid for my silence." She pulled out a worn envelope. Inside were bank statements, regular payments from a shell corporation, $15,000 a year for 24 years. "They told me it was just 10 drums," Eleanor continued, tears streaming down her face. 10 drums of low-level waste, sealed properly. Safe. I believed them because I needed to believe them, because the money kept my daughter in college, kept food on the table. "But it wasn't 10 drums," Garrett said softly. "No," Eleanor's voice broke. "When Margaret showed me your evidence, I counted. 43. They lied to me, and I helped them bury the truth because I was afraid and selfish and—" She couldn't continue. Garrett reached out and took her trembling hand. "You're here now. That's what matters." "I deleted records," she confessed. "In 2008, before the flood, I removed files about the contamination monitoring. Merrick paid me $20,000. I told myself it was for my granddaughter's education. But I knew what I was doing was wrong." She looked at him with desperate eyes. "I'm prepared to testify, to face whatever consequences come. I can't live with this anymore. Not after seeing those children on the news." Garrett called Benjamin Shaw. Within 2 hours, FBI agents arrived to take Eleanor's statement. She told them everything. Named names, provided bank records, described the systematic destruction of evidence that had enabled the cover-up to persist for 15 years. Her testimony would become a cornerstone of the federal prosecution against Merrick and his corporate backers. That afternoon, Benjamin called with news that made Garrett sit down hard. "FBI finished the preliminary investigation into Dr. Voss's death," Benjamin said. "They exhumed her vehicle from the impound lot, found evidence of brake line tampering, professional work, the kind that costs $50,000 and leaves no witnesses." Garrett closed his eyes. He'd suspected. But suspecting and knowing were different weights. "They're reopening it as a homicide investigation," Benjamin continued. "And here's the part that's going to put Merrick away forever. They found his phone records. 3 calls to a known fixer in the 48 hours before Dr. Voss died. Calls he can't explain. Payments he can't justify. Can they prove he ordered it? They can prove enough to charge him. Conspiracy to commit murder. Obstruction of justice. The environmental crimes are just the beginning. Garrett, this man is going away for life." Through the phone, Garrett heard the grim satisfaction in Benjamin's voice, but he felt only sadness. Dr. Voss had died for telling the truth, had left behind a husband and 2 children, had paid the ultimate price for doing her job with integrity. "Her family deserves to know," Garrett said. "They already do. FBI contacted them yesterday. They're—" Benjamin paused. "They're grateful. Her husband said she'd be proud of what you did, said she always believed the truth would come out eventually. It took 15 years. But it came out. That matters." The weeks that followed brought a cascade of revelations. The FBI arrested 3 corporate executives. Eleanor's testimony exposed a network of bribery and intimidation that reached into state government. Environmental groups filed a class action lawsuit on behalf of the affected families. And through it all, Garrett remained at the center of the storm, giving interviews, providing testimony, refusing to let the story fade back into bureaucratic obscurity. 6 months after that first morning when Kodiak had stopped at the railcar, Garrett sat in a federal courtroom in Minneapolis. The trial had lasted 3 weeks. The evidence was overwhelming. 43 drums of toxic waste, contamination maps, Dr. Voss's notebook, Eleanor's testimony, phone records, financial transactions, and the live stream video that had been viewed 50 million times. The jury deliberated for 4 hours. Vaughn Merrick was found guilty on all counts: conspiracy to commit murder, environmental crimes under the Superfund Act, obstruction of justice, witness intimidation, destruction of federal evidence. The list went on for 2 pages. The judge, a gray-haired woman who'd spent 30 years on the bench, didn't hide her contempt. "Mr. Merrick," she said, "you prioritize profit over human life. You silenced a dedicated scientist. You poisoned children. You corrupted public officials. You represent the worst of corporate malfeasance." She sentenced him to 45 years in federal prison with no possibility of parole. He'd be 97 years old before he saw freedom again. As marshals led Merrick away in handcuffs, he looked at Garrett one last time. The smooth confidence was gone. The polite smile had vanished. All that remained was the hollow recognition of a man who'd gambled everything and lost. Outside the courthouse, reporters swarmed. Cameras flashed. Questions flew like birds startled from cover. Garrett gave a simple statement, Kodiak sitting calmly at his side. "Doctor, Helen Voss tried to tell the truth 15 years ago. She died for it. Her evidence survived. Justice is slow, but it's not blind. The families affected by this contamination will receive compensation. The cleanup will continue for decades. And hopefully the next scientist who finds something wrong will be believed the first time." He declined further questions and walked away, Kodiak matching his pace perfectly. Lena waited by his truck, arms crossed, tears on her face despite her smile. "I'm proud of you, Dad," she said, hugging him tight. "I just did what I should have done a long time ago," he replied. "Listened when something didn't feel right." "No, but—" She pulled back to look him in the eyes. "You did more than that. You saved lives. You got justice for Dr. Voss. You made sure those kids get treatment. You're a hero. I'm a man with a good dog and a stubborn streak. That's all." But maybe she was right. Maybe refusing to look away was its own kind of heroism. The quiet kind. The kind that didn't come with medals or ceremonies. Just the knowledge that when it mattered, you'd chosen truth over comfort. The settlement check cleared 2 weeks later. $180,000 from the Superfund compensation program. Enough for a new start. Enough for safety. More than he'd ever expected to see in one place. Garrett had already found land. 50 acres in western Montana. Clean water, no history, no buried secrets. Just mountains and sky and room enough to breathe. But before he left Minnesota, there was one more thing to do. The dedication ceremony for the Dr. Helen Voss Memorial Preserve was held on a clear October morning. The contamination cleanup was still ongoing, would continue for years, but this section had been cleared and certified safe. A small park had been built near the lakeshore. Benches, a walking path, an interpretive center explaining the contamination, the cover-up, the cleanup. And at the center, a bronze plaque. Dr. Helen Voss, environmental engineer, 1967 to 2010. She tried to save us. We should have listened. Below her name was a second plaque. Garrett had fought against its inclusion, but the city council had insisted. Garrett Ashford, Navy SEAL veteran. He finished what she started. The ceremony drew 300 people, families of affected children, environmental activists, federal officials, and Dr. Voss's husband and 2 children, now adults, who'd lived 15 years thinking their mother's death was just a tragic accident. They approached Garrett after the speeches ended. "Thank you," Dr. Voss's daughter said simply. She was in her late 20s with her mother's eyes. "Thank you for not letting them win, for not letting her be forgotten." Garrett didn't know what to say. No words seemed adequate, so he just nodded and accepted the hug she offered. As the crowd dispersed, Garrett walked to the lakeshore with Kodiak. The water looked clean now, looked safe, but it would be a decade before the EPA fully certified it for swimming, before children could play here again without fear. Rachel Dwyer found them there. Ethan walked beside her, moving without a limp for the first time in months. The boy's color was better. His eyes were bright. The chelation therapy had worked. "Mr. Ashford," Rachel said, her voice thick with emotion, "Ethan wanted to thank you." The boy stepped forward, and suddenly shy. "You saved my life. The doctor said if I'd kept swimming in the lake, I'd probably be dead by now." Garrett knelt to the boy's level. You want to thank someone? Thank your friend Marcus. He's the one who helped you walk when you couldn't do it alone. And thank Dr. Voss. She documented everything so people like me could prove what was happening. Can I pet your dog? Garrett looked at Kodiak, who was watching the interaction with calm attention. He's a working dog. He doesn't usually, but Kodiak stepped forward on his own, lowering his head so Ethan could reach. The boy wrapped his arms around the dog's neck, and Kodiak stood perfectly still, accepting the gratitude with patient grace. He knows you're special, Garrett said quietly. He doesn't do that for just anyone. When Ethan finally let go, Kodiak licked the boy's face once, then returned to position at Garrett's marching. Professional distance restored. But something had shifted, some acknowledgement that their work here was complete. The crowd thinned as afternoon stretched toward evening. Garrett found himself alone at the memorial plaque, reading the words again. She tried to save us. We should have listened. Simple truth. Painful truth. The kind that should have been obvious from the beginning but took 15 years and 2 poisoned children and 1 stubborn veteran to finally surface. Garrett thought about his $8,000, his last savings. The money he'd spent on land that had brought nothing but complications and danger and sleepless nights. The best investment he'd ever made. Ready to go? Lena asked, appearing at his shoulder. Yeah, Garrett said. Montana's waiting. They drove north that evening, Garrett's truck loaded with everything he owned. Kodiak rode shotgun head out the window, ears streaming in the wind. Lena followed in her car, music loud enough to hear 3 vehicles back. As they crossed the state line, Garrett looked in the rearview mirror one last time. Minnesota disappeared behind them. The land he'd bought, the secrets he'd uncovered, the fight he'd won, all of it fading into distance and memory. But the lessons remained. The knowledge that silence was a choice. That one person with evidence and courage could change everything. That the truth, however long buried, eventually demanded to be heard. Montana welcomed them with open sky and mountain air that tasted like starting over. The land Garrett had purchased was everything the Minnesota property wasn't. Clean, simple, unburdened by history or secrets or the weight of other people's crimes. He built a cabin over the next 3 months. Did most of the work himself, Kodiak supervising from the shade, occasionally offering commentary in the form of tilted head and patient eyes. Lena visited for Thanksgiving. Brought her boyfriend, a quiet engineer who asked good questions and didn't talk too much. They ate dinner on the porch and watched the sun set over mountains that had been here long before humans and would remain long after. You seem happy, Dad, Lena said. I am, Garrett replied, surprised to find it true. Because of the Montana land. Because I finally did the right thing when it mattered. Everything else is just geography. The lawsuits continued for years. The class action on behalf of the affected families eventually settled for $80 million. The cleanup program ran through 2035. 3 more corporate executives were indicted. Eleanor Price received immunity in exchange for her testimony and spent her remaining years volunteering at the Dr. Voss Memorial Preserve, trying to atone. Merrick appealed his conviction twice. Lost both times. Would die in federal prison exactly as the judge had predicted. And Ethan Dwyer grew up healthy. Graduated high school, went to college on an environmental science scholarship funded by the settlement. Became the kind of scientist Dr. Voss had been. The kind who told the truth even when it was difficult. Full circle. Justice delayed but not denied. On the 5-year anniversary of the day Kodiak had stopped at the Railcar, Garrett received a package in the mail. Inside was a framed photograph of the memorial plaque and a letter from Dr. Voss's husband. Mr. Ashford, it read, I spent 15 years thinking my wife died for nothing, thinking her work had been buried with her. You proved me wrong. You showed that her evidence mattered, that her life mattered, that fighting for truth, even against powerful opposition, can eventually prevail. I will be grateful to you until the day I die. Thank you for giving her death meaning. Thank you for finishing her fight. Robert Voss. Garrett hung the photograph in his cabin. Next to it, he placed his own memorial, a small wooden frame containing a piece of rusted rail from the contamination site and a photo of Kodiak sitting beside it, vigilant and loyal. Some markers weren't warnings. They were acknowledgments. Reminders that the land remembered what men chose to forget. That truth, however long buried, eventually demanded light. That evening, Garrett sat on his porch with Kodiak at his feet and watched the Montana sunset paint the sky in colors that had no names. The dog was older now, gray creeping into his muzzle, moving a little slower, but still alert, still professional, still the partner who'd walked into darkness and back without hesitation. We did good, boy, Garrett said quietly. Kodiak's tail moved once against the wooden boards. Not celebration, not pride, just the simple acknowledgement of a job completed, a mission fulfilled. They sat together as stars emerged one by one, tiny lights against the infinite dark. Witnesses to everything, judges of nothing, just there as they'd always been, as they'd always be. And Garrett Ashford, 49 years old, Navy SEAL, veteran guardian of inconvenient truths, felt something he hadn't felt in years. Peace, not the absence of conflict, not the silence of unasked questions, but the hard-won calm that came from knowing you'd stood up when it mattered, that you'd chosen truth over comfort, that you'd refused to look away, the kind of peace that could only be earned, never given. Always worth the fight. The wind moved through the pines, carrying the scent of snow from distant peaks. Kodiak shifted closer, warm and solid against Garrett's leg. Somewhere in the valley below, a coyote called and was answered, and the world turned indifferent and eternal while two old warriors rested in the gathering dark, their battles finally behind them, their conscience finally clear.